Now, Ukraine was hit by the largest aerial bombardment since the start of the war over the weekend. In response, Donald Trump has threatened tougher sanctions on Russia. Now talks between the US and the European Commission are underway to discuss what those restrictions might look like. Let's talk about all of that and more with the former US security advisor to Donald Trump in his first term and the decorated war hero, General HR McMaster. A very good morning to you, General. Great to have you with us.
Hey, Wolf, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with a big picture question. And obviously, you know President Trump well. You worked with him in his first administration. What is his genuine intention as it relates to Russia and Ukraine? Is there a lot of method behind what sometimes looks like madness on this, or are you worried yourself this time round versus Trump Mark 1?
I think what he wants is good, right? He wants an end of the war on terms that that are favorable to the Ukrainians and the West. But what Putin has done, I think, is confused him about the best way to get there. What Putin does is he, of course, uses flattery. You can't go wrong there with President Trump oftentimes. But then what he'll do is he'll hold out the prospect for a really big deal on something else, like reduction of nuclear arms. He'll try to expand the issue set so he can sort of put Ukraine in a box as a country that's really not as important, or a situation that's not as important. And then what he'll do is try to create this sense of aggrievement. It really was NATO enlargement, right, that put him in a really precarious position. What he calls these root causes, which the root cause, of course, is his aggression against Ukraine. And then he'll sort of portray any other alternative or President Zelensky is weak. And he thinks he can win this because he thinks that the West is weak, Europe, the United States, that we're weak, that we're decadent, that we lack the resolve, we're divided. So I don't think he's going to get what he wants. Putin is going to get what he wants from President Trump. But he strings President Trump along with these kind of false promises of a big deal and this false narrative, that somehow he's the aggrieved party.
So is the implication what you're saying there that President Trump has sort of fallen for it in the short term, or do you not think that's the case?
Well, I think he has kind of fallen for it in the short term, but I don't think he has not given Putin what he wanted. Remember what Putin wanted in Alaska, right? Is he wanted President Trump to sign up for terms for a ceasefire that were unacceptable to the Ukrainians, unacceptable to European leaders, and then he would use that to drive a wedge between the United States and our European allies. And to divide the West further, because Putin's ambitions are grand here, right? He not only wants to dominate Ukraine and have just a rump, maybe Ukrainian state that he can rule over even indirectly. He wants to make the Black Sea a Russian lake. He wants to break NATO apart and then extend his influence further into Europe. Probably dominate once again, the former republics of the Soviet Union. As well as dominate the former states of the Warsaw Pact. So, he wants to restore the Russian Empire, and he won't stop until he is stopped.
What's your sort of message to European leaders, including the Prime Minister here, in terms of whether they could be doing more? I think it's fair to say that everyone has stepped up significantly here, and obviously various pledges to increase defence spending. But is there much more that could be done? And I think India is a really interesting example, because we've just done a free trade deal with India. Right. And of course, President Trump is striking tariffs on India because they're buying oil from Russia. So how do you see, as much as we look at President Trump and worry about some of the rhetoric, should there be more being done here?
Well, first of all, I would say that European leaders, including the Prime Minister, have done a really good job in engaging President Trump. President Trump, I think what he wants to achieve is actually positive. How he goes about it is problematic sometimes. And I think that he learns from these conversations. He does evolve his thinking. So the engagement has been, I think, quite effective. But in terms of what more can be done, of course, burden of responsibility sharing and defense, that's in the positive column. I think that's helping the transatlantic relationship and the transatlantic alliance. But there's much more that can be done in two areas: to sustain support for Ukraine, and then also to put more pressure on Russia at a time when Putin is actually quite vulnerable. I mean, his economy is in shambles. And I think the two main things to do are to highlight what you already have really highlighted, is what is the international system that is allowing Putin to evade more severe effects of sanctions, including India purchasing the cheap oil, but actually Europe still buying 20% of the oil that they used to buy and energy from Russia. Reducing that dramatically, I think, would be important. secondary sanctions on those who are really foundational to Russia being able to continue this onslaught that you mentioned at the outset against Ukraine. And China is at the forefront of that. So there are discussions, as you know, going on now between European leaders and U.S. leaders about what are the nature of some of these secondary sanctions, financial sanctions, other sanctions that can impose costs on China for really underwriting this horrible war against Ukraine.
One more question on this area, but it links to China. To what extent do you think President Trump's motivations to be otherwise more conciliatory towards Putin than perhaps the facts would suggest, it comes from him wanting to try and peel Russia away from China? Is that a genuine motivation, and is it a legitimate one, or is it wishful thinking?
It's a genuine motivation. It's legitimate, right? Because, of course, the geostrategists of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, this is Mackinder and Spikeman, from a British perspective, said, hey, it would be a terrible thing if there was a hostile power that dominated the Eurasian landmass. Britain can't stand for that. It's not good for the world. So dividing them is a positive, but they can't be divided at this moment. We saw the optics from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, the virtual BRICS meeting that happened yesterday. They've declared their undying love for one another, Putin and Xi Jinping. I think the opportunity lies in gluing them together, because what we've been doing is pretending that we can separate them, and it allows them to cover for one another, especially for China to cover for Russian aggression. I think you can make the argument, Wilf, that China is fighting a proxy war against Europe and the West through the Russians. And the sooner we make that connection, the more effective we can be, I think, on putting the pressure on Putin sufficient for him to conclude he can't win the war at an acceptable cost and risk. And I think that's the moment when you maybe do have a chance at a ceasefire that can end the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
That's really interesting. So harder on China as part of this and harder on Russia as opposed to trying to peel each of them away from each other.
Right. Stop pretending that they're not acting in concert. And of course, they've brought into this axis of aggressors. I mean, the photos, from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Kim Jong-un, and the Iranian delegation there. I mean, there are maybe 30,000 more troops coming from North Korea to fight alongside Russians.
I wanted to touch on the UK military, because last time you came on this programme, you said the UK military makes me want to cry because of your assessment of the sort of capability had slipped over the decades. It's not been that long, a year or so since we last spoke. Has that assessment changed, or are you given a little bit of hope by small increases in defence spending? But we're only talking about, increases of 0.2, 0.3%.
Yeah, it is obviously much more positive in terms of the increase, but it takes a really long time to build back the capacity and the range of capabilities, the skill sets. Once you cut your military, I mean, it's much easier to sustain a professional. This is why it made me want to cry, because because the British Army still is extremely professional, extremely capable, but just not big enough. And in an all-volunteer force, it's hard to grow that capacity back. So when a decision point comes up again, maybe a couple of decades from now, after rebuilding, which will be painful, that capacity, I think that's a really important consideration. It's easy to cut it, very hard to grow it back.
In terms of the president, just coming back to him, you said he likes praise. Obviously, you've worked closely with him and had to work out what to say when and in order to sort of achieve your aims in those meetings. When you look at Trump Mark II, if you look at those cabinet meetings, in fact, there was also a dinner with tech leaders last week. I mean, I was there for the first term. The level of praise around the table has gone up, and it's unanimous now. Oh. Does that, I mean, as a military leader who is, forthright with your views, and I'm sure has faced forthright views back to you, does it worry? Does it even sicken you to watch? What's your take on it?
Well, Wilf, there's a reason why I only lasted 13 months, right? so yeah. I mean, I think it's a disservice to the president to tell the president what the president wants to hear. I saw it as my job to guard President Trump's independence of judgment, to get him best analysis, to get him multiple options. Because he's the guy who got elected, right? So he should get to make the decisions. The problem is, in an environment of competitive sycophancy, what you get is you get people telling the boss what the boss wants to hear, so you can maybe mask some potential negative long-term costs and consequences of decisions, but also many of these people who engage in this kind of sycophancy, what they don't want is to help Donald Trump with his agenda. What they want to do is manipulate decisions consistent with their agenda. And so I tried to protect against that, to put into place a process, decision-making process that got the president a broad view of perspectives, not to try to control him or manipulate his decisions, but allow him to understand fully these complex problem sets and make sound decisions.
Is that happening now? Are you worried that it's not?
I'm worried that it's not happening. It's been widely reported, and this is sort of, bureaucratic politics and everything, but it seems as if some people have convinced President Trump that his own staff was the so-called deep state, the source of bureaucratic inertia. When in fact his own staff, that's the National Security Council, National Economic Council, is really helpful to pulling together these options, presenting them for decision to the president. I think this is how one of the reasons why you've seen some of these wide swings with tariffs and other decisions.
General, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Hey, Wolf, great to be with you.
Great to